Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 20 of my Industrial Revolution 3 playthrough. In this episode, we are going to do our oil processing planning and get started mining oil. Enjoy! Now that we have concrete all set up, we can now dive into the oil processing. Got lots of new recipes here. Some of this stuff we won't need yet, but we might as well get started because it will get us to explosives and then cliff explosives. So before we begin, we should make a plan here, and we kind of do have some choices on how we want to do this. We could plan for a specific output, or just plan for a certain input, or even just base it on a certain ratio of machines. Now, one thing to keep in mind with our oil processing machines here is that these are machines that make pollution. So it's 6 pollution a minute per refinery and 3 per chemical plant. Not to mention any gases that we vent will also create some amount of pollution, and we'll kind of talk about that later. But keep in mind that these are plants that use pollution, so if you want to use productivities, which you could, it will be doubly bad because the productivity modules do add pollution to recipes. For now, let's not put any modules in and see what the effect would be. Where this is our output and this is per crafting recipe, that we will get all this stuff, and ultimately one of two things will happen with the resources. With heavy oil, it might be turned into lubricant. The light oil could be turned into flamethrower ammo, and the petroleum here could be turned into plastic bars. And any natural gas we create would be a byproduct which we could use as fuel. And so instead of basing it on outputs like oil or sulfuric acid, how about we just base it on assuming that all of the resources would be not destroyed, but let's say destroyed by consuming for fuel and not actually making any items. And then we'll worry about those items in a different recipe because we can't show both on one plan here. So let's say our ultimate goal then is to crack this down into the base fuels. Well, when we do this, we will have 60 heavy oil. So we'll do the processing recipe that adds silica to this and water to make it light oil and petroleum. And for some reason, when we add the heavy oil processing recipe here, it just does not link to these products. And I don't understand why, because the previous way that helmod worked is it would just link to whatever your output was for the ingredient for whatever was below. And I really don't understand why it's not working, because we can push it down to a parent block, which then does make it an output, but we go to the parent block and it says first block can't link, and I don't know why. I mean, we could type it in. Well, kind of. You're supposed to be able to type it in. So some serious changes have been done to helmod that just completely just messed up how it works. But instead of spending forever trying to diagnose why this thing isn't working, let's just do it the dirty way. Cut this production down to 50% so everything works. And it still doesn't even let you type the number in, which does not make any sense at all. It does let it do it if it's down here though, instead of the first one. Shrug. Because now we can type it in. Is it gonna work? Okay. That doesn't make any sense, because then you go to the parent block that's supposed to be an overview and it's just a bunch of zeros. But you come down here and it works. And of course it says 0 for quantity there, so becoming increasingly frustrated with helmod. I have my fingers crossed that eventually it's gonna work again, or at least as you would expect. Why would you have a block up here that gives you no useful information and just have an extra step required? But we'll make it work. So we've broken down the heavy oil into light oil, petroleum, and that sour gas. So now the next step is to take the light oil that we have, half of which comes from the first step and half of which comes from the second, and we have to break that down. And does it link? It does. And the important thing here is to make sure that this is on the bottom, because if we put it up here, it will only have access to this light oil and not this light oil. So depending on how you want to set things up, you need to make sure that these are all in the right order. And because we want to use all of the light oil, we put it on the bottom, which then gives us our 2 output resources of petroleum and the natural gas. And these are the outputs we would expect. So now we can modify the numbers to try to find a perfect ratio, or we could always just change the machines as well. So if we do compute by factory, we can change the top one and we'll get some numbers. They're not as clean because we're just typing machines in, but it's not working though. because we now have extra heavy oil. So can't do that either. I feel like I'm bug testing this. Well, this isn't the perfect ratio, but it's reasonably close. And one other thing to consider is how much crude oil do we actually want to process with this setup? Now, we don't want it to be enormously large, but it would be kind of annoying if it ended up being too small, and then we had to expand a bunch of lines of machines, because it's not just this, but it's also the things making the plastic and making the sulfur and everything else. So we kind of want to go a little big here and just try to make something that hopefully will last us quite a while. And this actually seems pretty reasonable. So if we look at our output, we're going to have this 83 of petroleum and 83 of natural gas. And let's just call that 166 units a second, and each one has 400 kilojoules or 0.4 megajoules in it, which means if this was going full blast, it would provide 66 megawatts for the factory. And that seems pretty reasonable. So we'll go with this for now. And I guess this is a good time to talk about modules. Because we have a setup with multiple tiers of machines, this is when productivity modules start to get really powerful because their productivities will stack on top of themselves. However, at the same time, because these machines make pollution, it can potentially get really bad. And I'm noticing also, it's not adding the pollution in there. Sigh. Oh well. So we're making a little bit more than 2 pollution to do this. And our output was that 166. So if we add productivity modules, we make more, we make more, and we make more. So that'll bring us from 166 to 102. So a pretty modest increase. However, look what it does to the pollution, where before we had a little more than 2 pollution. Now we're looking at about 5 pollution. So it's a lot of extra pollution, but it's also a lot of extra electricity. So let's calculate the difference between using productivity modules and using efficiency modules. Because when it comes to making fuel, you actually want to be really careful because yes, you want to get more fuel for your input. However, if that costs fuel, it's possible that even though you're using productivity modules and getting more fuel, the energy consumption of those machines may actually be higher than the extra fuel you're getting as a result of those productivity modules, at least when you compare them to efficiencies anyway. So let's add this up and find out what the net amount of fuel would be, where it's 101, let's be exact, 0.1, and times 2, times 0.4 megawatts. So that would be about 80 megawatts, but then we need to remove the energy consumption of this whole process. So 7.4, 4, and 5.6, which gets us to 63.88. But let's take everything out, and we'll be exact again, and that is slightly more megawatts than we were getting, but we also have to remove the energy consumption. So 3.8, 1.9, and 2.6, which means our net amount of fuel would be 58 without the productivities. So using productivities gave us 63, and using no modules at all gave us 58. So that means for a very large amount of pollution, we got a tiny amount more of fuel. However, that is not how we would actually run these machines. Instead, we would run them with efficiency modules, which not only reduce the electricity, but also the pollution. So the amount of fuel that it creates will be the same, but now we have to subtract the less amounts of 1.6, and let's just say 0.8 and 1.1. which gives us 63.17. And as a reminder, with the productivity modules, we got 63.88. So were the productivity modules better? The tiniest amount, yes, they were. And actually, now that I realize that I only put 2 modules in here when these machines can actually take 3. But I'm assuming that the numbers would essentially be the same. Adding 1 more productivity module and adding 1 more efficiency module more or less accomplish the same thing. It's a slight nerf to the efficiency module because instead of subtracting another 30% of energy consumption, it's only 20 because it hit the limit of negative 80. So this makes the productivity modules slightly better, but nonetheless, it kind of goes to show you that at least with this setup and as it pertains to creating fuel, that there's really not that much benefit to the productivity modules. I would say This all depends on if you actually want to make the fuel or not. If you don't care about the fuel and you're only doing it for something like, say, plastic, then it probably is worth the productivity modules. But in this sense, that we're just going to be burning all these extra things for some time, I'm thinking that the efficiency modules will be best. But at least at this stage, it doesn't matter too much. So now we have an idea of our output, and we need to process the other things that we have here. We are going to be making some sour gas, so we would want to turn all of that into sulfur. And of course the number is red. I see. It's red because making the sulfur from the sour gas actually creates a small amount of water. So it made the water requirement slightly lower. So we'll actually need to make sure we handle this correctly by putting the water from the sour gas into the oil processing plants just to make sure that water goes away. So that's why that number is red. It's actually acceptable in this situation for that to be red. Well, that's going to create an incredible amount of sulfur, and it's going to need a ton of plants. And of course, we could put our productivities in there and get more, but it also dramatically increases the amount of pollution and the energy consumption. Like it takes it from, well, let's just put the efficiencies in there, 1.5 megawatts to 14.8. It's an enormous difference. So since we're at the point of the factory where we don't really want to go nuts with this stuff, we probably want to keep sticking with the efficiencies. Or we could do speeds, I suppose. But it also increases pollution, although not to the same extent as the productivities do. But we have a ton of space, so we can just build the 24 required chemical plants for this. This will create some carbon dioxide that we currently don't have a use for. We could attempt to save it, and we could also dump it, but we will deal with that later. It creates an output of sulfur, which we then want to put into sulfuric acid, which has a huge water requirement in itself. So all of these things will be kind of connected to the same water system, and whatever needs the water will just take the extra water from the sour gas. That will require a small amount of iron pellets, and it's weird how it put that on the top. Because it did so, the number is wrong. It needs to be down here, but it's still not linking. Well, I imagine most of these machines will get their own assembler, so I guess we'll just not calculate it. We could use the bitumen, but it's probably just better to hold on to it for later recipes that can use it. And also we're going to need some of that silica, and will it link? It doesn't look like it wants to. And because it doesn't come up here, it means we can't just start a new line, so... well, let's see, there is one thing we can try. Let's make the silica and then push it into a deeper tier here. And it still doesn't link. I don't know. Well, I think we've gotten about as much as we can out of this. So let's make a new line now that we know the numbers, because we need to calculate for the other processes that would use some of these resources. So we need to calculate for heavy oil, which would be making the lubricant, and we know that it's about 125. Wow, it won't. It still doesn't let you do it. Well, I guess we'll make this 125, so it makes the heavy oil 125. So that means we'll need 10 plants with 125 steam a second, so we'll have to calculate for that. And it's going to make 125 sour gas, which is close to the total amount of sour gas that this other stuff is making, but I don't feel like we should plan for the absolute worst case scenario, because that would just be way too much sour gas processing. So since this amount of sour gas, 125, is less than what this is, I think we can just assume it will be sufficient. So that's one thing we'll be making. We don't need to worry about light oil, but also we're going to need to turn some petroleum into plastic. So let's just assume we use all of it for that purpose. Oh, I just realized that I didn't include the petroleum from the previous two steps when we were calculating for fuel. But that would have affected both the productivity modules and the efficiency modules more or less the same way, I would imagine. Actually, that's probably a nerf against the productivity modules, because the stuff down here gets maximum effective productivity because it's 3 stages down, where this one only gets 1 stage of productivity and this one only gets 2 stages. So if they were included, it would actually make the average fuel production go down if they were all productivities. Oh, since we're here, how about let's just calculate it using the correct numbers up here at the top. So it would be about 98. And switching these out, which means the amount we would make with productivities would be 105, where we were making 98 without the productivities. So they're still pretty close. Productivities are slightly better, but it does create a ton of pollution, and it does put a much higher load on the electrical network. Even though we would make it back by burning fuel, nonetheless, it's a big loop of resources that would ultimately not really give us that much more. We might want to revisit this later when we have better modules, But for now, it seems like we can just keep our factory nice and clean, and that will be good enough. But anyway, we had 166.7, and I guess we'll just have to change this. Manually type it in until we get our numbers. That would create about 16 plastic bars a second. And that seems fine. We'll put the efficiency modules in there. So now we have an idea for the size of the setup for the plastic bars, the setup for the lubricant, and then everything else. It will have supporting components, but we can do that along the way. I would lay more bricks down if we could, but it takes quite a bit of time to grind through our existing stone bricks here, so we can't really lay more down until there's room for them. But now we've got a big shopping list. It is a lot to handcraft, but after we get this set up, we're really not going to need very many of these buildings, so it seems worthwhile to just handcraft them for now rather than automating them and then just having them sit in chests and not use them anymore. But another thing that we need to do is handle the train stations for this, because we're going to need to pick up the oil, and there's a couple of different places we could do it, but the safest place is probably down here, just because it's the most out of the way compared to where biters currently are. We'll have to clear some of them out, and we'll also have to go over the water, but we could have tracks which kind of come along here and then join to the shared track and then go where it needs to go. Well, it is mostly liquids, which is nice, but it will require some input resources such as iron, as well as stone, and interestingly, we're handling both iron and stone right here. So if it was in this general vicinity, it would be pretty convenient, but we also want to leave it room to expand. So I'm thinking, how about we start it like in this area right here perhaps, and then just kind of extend to the right, and hopefully that won't get in the way of anything. And in fact, we probably don't even have to use this combined rail at all. We could have it just kind of skip it, since it wouldn't even be a part of that. And also sour gas is right there too, and we might need that. So that seems good. Well, let's go out there and fight some biters because they are in the way, but also we're going to need some pump jacks. Looks like 9 of them. We might as well start placing the rail now. So how about we just build the station itself? It'll probably come in through here, but in fact we could just line it up with these other stations. We might as well, since all of the other infrastructure is here. So if it was the exact same orientation as the rest, it would be like this, but we are not going to need any of that. Let's change this to crude oil unload. And I did notice that I kind of put way too much steam in these because they really only need about 1 steam canister at a time, because any extras will get filled up, so it doesn't need to have quite so many. So we have a lot of extra steam canisters now. Because you see when this comes here, it really only had like 1 canister it needed to fill. So that was enough. Well, we'll just hold on to them for now. I'm sure we'll use them for something eventually. So there's the train. And how exactly would we want this to line up? It all just sort of depends on whatever you think looks good. That kind of does, because we can put a connector in there. And if we've got this lined up, all of the pumps should be connected to the fluid wagon, which they are. They won't necessarily empty from the train car completely evenly, but that also doesn't really matter because the pumping rate is so fast, it doesn't really need to be balanced. But now we know the position of the rail, so let's just make it a straight line because straight lines are better. This time we don't have to worry about placing any path beneath it because the train doesn't care if there's stone tiles underneath it or not. Don't tell me that is going to be in the way. Oh, just barely. We can avoid it. Hey, there's some rubber trees right here. Not that we really care about them anymore. Okay, we might as well just have the track come through here. So let's lay some landfill down and probably lay more or less a minimum amount because it doesn't really matter right now. But we'll do that and kind of fill it out a little bit just so it's a little nicer. But we've got some biters. Let's see what we can do. It's nice having the machine gun. Let's see, there was one more set of them. Are the robots gonna last long enough? Nope. Let's just throw some more out. Oh, there's like a cliff right there. I like how they can take care of all the biters, so I can focus on targeting down all the structures. Awesome. Alright, well that track can go anywhere, but for now, we already have a design for the station, and luckily it's pointed the right way. Let's try right there as a preliminary place to put it. Seems pretty good. We're not actually going to need any of this, because only one station needs to handle fuel. We'll switch this, crude oil load, and the pumps need to be facing the other direction. And we need to get back there now. I don't know if we'll be able to use our same bridge. Depends on how much space is here. It looks like it barely might work. That was not planned. So close here. But it does fit. Well, in this situation, we're not going to need to have any type of rail signals or anything, because this is going to be the only train on this track unless something changes. So let's get this wire hooked up, but we might have to be careful how we do it, because the wire reach isn't very good. So we need to place them in particular locations in order to get it to go the whole way. So now we have electricity. It would be great to have a radar too. How about right in here, because it's the right distance. Alright, we can add all of these oil patches in to Yarm, so we can follow the remainder. It won't really tell us how fast we can produce it, but it will tell us the percentage of where it started on where it is. So we'll still be able to use this to track fluids. And it doesn't terribly matter how we hook up all these things, just in whatever way seems to work. Well, they're all pumping. We'll definitely want to have efficiency modules in here to clean them all up, because that's another pollution producing machine. And they are making crude oil just fine. And I suppose we can hook it up right there. But they are going to fill up at different rates, so this is probably a good opportunity to use some of our Nixie tubes. So let's use the tubes to determine the percent that it is full. And I will use 3 tubes for this, even though technically we only need 2, because the third digit would only be for 100%. But let's do a couple of tubes. And we'll also need to have an arithmetic combinator in here. So we need some tubes. We'll just kind of put them right there. And when they're in a row like this, if you connect a wire to the one on the end, it will connect them to the rest of them as well. So we'll put the arithmetic combinator there, and then we need to hook up each tank, and it might look a little cleaner if they go to their nearby pole. And then into the combinator, we need to look at the total amount of crude oil that we might have, which would be 100K. And this calculation is quite easy, because to find out the percent, we simply need to take the amount of crude oil and divide it by 1,000, and then the output will be crude oil. Connect it to the Nixie tubes, but nothing will appear because the tubes do require you to tell it which signal that it is activating on. So it's crude oil, and it doesn't really matter if you do anything else, but we'll just make it accurate. And now we have a percent, and it will continue to go up as they fill up. So now, instead of hovering over each tank and trying to guess how much crude oil is in there, we have a combinator to just do the work for us. And you can kind of see how this last digit isn't really necessary, because it's only going to activate at 100%. And if this wasn't here, the digits would still operate the same. So there would be 2 zeros here if it was 100. So you could just remove this last Nixie tube and it really wouldn't make a difference. But I'll put the 3 in there. Although we also need to put the tracks for the train to return. So let's go back and finish up the rail here. And we're probably going to have more trains park here. But for now, to make life easy, how about we just haphazardly put a loop in there and not worry too much about its location. It's not like it has any signals or anything, so it'll be easy enough to move later if we need to. So let's hop in the train, crude oil load, and I don't think we need to use fluid count for this. I think we could just say full cargo and then unload empty cargo. So let's see if it works. It hops in. We get loaded very quickly. It's down to 0 again, but that's what happens because fluids transfer so quickly. But we have enough fluid now to go further, so let's just take the train back, and it changed to black this time because it has crude oil in it. And it parks, unloads very quickly, and it's done. So that's why you don't really need to worry about balancing these tanks too much, because it is very quick. Okay then, it's time for our build. However, that's going to have to wait until the next episode. Thanks for watching, and I will see you later.